Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most studied military and political leaders in history. We have also talked extensively about Napoleon's military campaigns, and you can go ahead and check out our videos on them. However, when analysing the Napoleonic period of Europe, the historiography often focuses on the main protagonist of that era, Napoleon and his exploits. Today, we want to look at the most ill-fated campaign of Napoleon from the perspective of the other side. How did Russia prepare for Napoleon's invasion in 1812? This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history. Join them by scanning the QR code on your screen, via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. It is the year 1807. Napoleon had already neutralized Austria and Prussia as great powers of Europe after decisively defeating them on several occasions. Britain is as mighty as ever at sea, but its influence on the continent is waning, as its old foe, France, is victoriously marching through Europe, dictating the new shape of the old world virtually single-handedly. The last remaining European great power, Russia, has not been beaten to the point of becoming almost a satellite to France, like Austria and Prussia, but following a comprehensive defeat in Friedland, its emperor, Alexander I, is not in a position to refuse Napoleon's demands. Russia joins France's Continental blockade, which aims to cripple Britain's economy by banning British exports to Europe. But after a series of impressive victories, Napoleon's fortunes started to change in the place he least expected, in Spain, which was well past its glory days. By 1808, the French army started experiencing significant problems in the guerrilla war waged by Spain. Suddenly, Napoleon's army stopped seeming so invincible. On top of that, the Continental blockade was not working so well. Smuggling and the transportation of British goods by ships flying neutral flags occurred regularly. Napoleon was giving licenses to loyal French merchants, allowing them to import British goods. Such incomplete enforcement of the blockade was inevitably going to create doubts in other European countries, including Russia. Britain was the largest trading partner of the Russian Empire at the time, transporting grain, timber, iron, and other raw materials, while importing manufactured goods and colonial products, such as coffee and sugar. Even though the Russian government tolerated the smuggling of British goods, the blockade had a major negative impact on the Russian economy. In 1810, Russia adopted the Tariff of 1810, which made it easier to import British goods, while penalizing French luxury goods. Russia was quietly abandoning the Continental blockade, which was contrary to its interests from the start. Napoleon was enraged by this. Of course, the Continental blockade was not the sole reason for tensions between the two empires, as geopolitical issues such as the ongoing Russo-Ottoman War, the future of German territories, the emergence of the Duchy of Warsaw from the recently partitioned Poland as a potential counterweight to Russia in Eastern and Central Europe, Alexander I's refusal to give his sister in marriage to Napoleon, along with the strong opposition to Alexander I's rapprochement with Napoleon in the Russian elite, were among the other major factors. By late 1810, the European diplomatic circles had started quietly discussing the inevitability of war between France and Russia. In 1811, Napoleon publicly threatened the Russian ambassador to Paris, Prince Kurakin. And to avoid being defeated by Napoleon once again, the Russian Empire approached preparations for the war thoroughly, in some cases well in advance. We can broadly define 4 main areas of Russia's preparations: intelligence, diplomacy, military, and national solidarity. Starting with Russia's intelligence work in anticipation of the war would make sense here, since it played a crucial role in understanding that the war was coming. Here, 2 young Russian diplomats serving in France are of particular interest to us. One of them was Count Karl von Nesselrode, a German man who later served as Russia's foreign minister for 4 decades. He was appointed the deputy head of mission in Paris in 1810 at the age of 27. The other was Alexander Chernyshev, a Russian officer and an aide-de-camp of Alexander I, who first met Napoleon at the age of 22, bringing the Russian emperor's message to the French emperor. Chernyshev later also had a distinguished career in Russia, serving as its war minister for more than 2 decades. These two men forged a close friendship as they ran Russia's espionage in France and had a similar understanding of France's intentions towards Russia. Nesselrode's sources were mostly diplomatic, while Chernyshev had military assets. Some of them were very high profile. According to Dominic Lieven, two of the most famous and less principled incumbent and former ministers of Napoleon, Joseph Fouché and Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand, were among Nesselrode's sources, providing secret information for money, personal gain, and due to deteriorating relations with Napoleon. Nesselrode had direct access to Alexander I through Mikhail Speransky, the Tsar's most influential minister. His reports ranged from French military dispositions in Poland to the activities of French agents in Russia to Napoleon's personal habits and health. The last was a matter of genuine strategic importance, given how entirely the French state revolved around its emperor. But perhaps the most important document obtained by Nesselrode was the French Foreign Minister Champagny's top-secret report on the vision of future French foreign policy submitted to Napoleon in 1810. In this report, Champagny argued that Russia was Britain's natural ally and that France should return to its traditional policy of supporting the Ottoman Empire, Poland and Sweden against Russia. There was an emphasis on Poland, as the French foreign minister envisaged the best-case scenario as Poland restoring its independence and control over territories west of the Dnieper. Of course, this would only have been possible if Napoleon had decisively defeated Russia. Chernyshev's military contacts provided equally valuable intelligence. His reports covered French operations in Spain, and crucially, Napoleon's preparations for a future eastern campaign, new cavalry formations to counter Russia's superior horsemen, and specially designed wagons to withstand the Russian winter, one of which Chernyshev personally visited and sketched. Chernysshev's sources told him that Napoleon's offensive strategy against Russia envisaged inflicting the decisive blow by his central army, commanded by the emperor himself, on Vilna. Arguably the most important information reported by Chernyshev to Alexander I were monthly updates of numbers, movements, and deployments of every regiment in the army provided to him by an officer of the French Ministry of War. His last report, delivered to the Russian War Minister Barclay de Tolly, touches on the strategy he recommended the Russian command follow to defeat Napoleon, reflecting the mood and information he gathered from the French. In hindsight, we can say that this is exactly what happened. The intelligence provided by Nesselrode and Chernyshev was crucial to the Russian preparations for Napoleon's impending invasion. I speak often to officers who are of great merit and knowledge, and who have no affection for the head of the French government. I have asked them about what strategy would be best in the coming war, considering the theatre of operations, the strength and the character of our adversary. With one accord, these Frenchmen had told him that Napoleon would long for big battles and rapid victories, so the Russians should avoid giving him what he wanted and should instead harass him with their light forces. The French officers told him that the system we should follow in this war is the one of which Fabius and indeed Lord Wellington offer the best examples. It is true that our task will be more difficult in that the theatre of operations is, for the most part, open countryside. Partly for that reason, it was crucial to have large reserve forces held well in the rear, so that the war could not be lost by a single battle. But if the Russians could sustain this war for 3 campaigns, then the victory will certainly be ours, even if we don't win great victories, and Europe will be delivered from its oppressor. Chernyshev also played a notable role in Russia's diplomatic preparations ahead of the French invasion. Russia's diplomatic strategy was quite predictable, as it aimed to end the other wars it was involved in to gather as many resources as possible against Napoleon, deter other countries from joining France's attack on Russia, and find allies against Napoleon. In the run-up to Napoleon's invasion, Russia was at war with the Ottomans and Iran, and feared an attack from Sweden, which it had recently defeated. Following Russia's victory against Sweden in 1809, Napoleon's famous Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte became Sweden's new monarch. Despite expectations, he did not side with France, and instead prioritized Swedish interests. While Bernadotte was still in France, Chernyshev established a cordial relationship with him and served as Alexander I's intermediary when Bernadotte became Sweden's crown prince. It was important for Russia to ensure its northern borders were secure, and Bernadotte assured Russia that he had no intention of joining Napoleon. Bernadotte was, in truth, no admirer of Napoleon, and calculated that even if France won, Russia would survive to seek revenge. Russia also promised Swedish support in acquiring Norway. Following these considerations, Sweden decided to enter into a military alliance with Russia in 1812, allowing the Russian army to have extra troops that would have otherwise had to guard Finland against a potential Swedish attack. On the eve of Napoleon's invasion, Russia was also at war with the Ottomans. They surely had the upper hand in this war fought in the Balkans, Moldova and the Caucasus, but for a while the Ottomans insisted on continuing to fight, encouraged by Britain and France. However, Russian Field Marshal Kutuzov achieved a decisive victory, allowing Russia to sign the Treaty of Bucharest with the Ottomans in May 1812, merely a month before the start of Napoleon's invasion. The terms of the treaty were not overly harsh for the Ottomans, as the Russian government wanted to conclude the war as quickly as possible to allow Kutuzov's 43,000-strong army of the Danube to join the war against Napoleon, which it did in September 1812. Ending the war with Iran, seen as an inferior force, for which Russia had allocated a much smaller army in a distant theatre, was not considered an immediate necessity. The war with the Khazars continued. Of course, there were also Austria and Prussia, severely weakened and humiliated by Napoleon, waiting for an opportunity to turn against him. Alexander was in talks with the Austrian and Prussian monarchs and their representatives, trying to persuade them to join him in the upcoming war against France. But once it became clear that the Russian military strategy, which we will discuss shortly, would be purely defensive, it did not make sense for Austria or Prussia to join Russia. Instead, they reluctantly joined Napoleon's Grande Armée. However, there is an important caveat to Austria's and Prussia's participation in the invasion. Both countries sent relatively small armies of 30,000 and 20,000 respectively, and their involvement in Napoleon's Russia campaign was very limited. On top of that, Austria agreed to keep the Galicia front of the war quiet, instead sending its army into Russia through the Duchy of Warsaw. This narrowed the front and gave the defending Russian army an advantage. Thus, Russian diplomacy also played an important role in positioning Russia to better defend itself against Napoleon's army. But of course, none were more important than Russia's military preparations. After a series of painful defeats inflicted by Napoleon, Russia was determined to reverse its fortunes. One of the biggest weaknesses of the Russian army in the early Napoleonic period was the lack of well-trained junior officers. Alexander I tackled this problem by adopting the Plan of Military Upbringing in 1805, which envisaged the creation of new military schools throughout Russia funded by local nobility. Graduates were then sent to the 1st and 2nd Army Cadet Corps, where they finalized their training and became officers. In 1807, the Dvoyansky Regiment, a unit created for young Russian noblemen to train and later become officers, was established as well. More reforms followed when Alexander I appointed Alexei Arakcheyev as Minister of War in 1808. A former inspector of artillery with first-hand knowledge of the army's weaknesses, Arakcheyev had already begun reforming the artillery before taking the ministry. Gun and shell quality were overhauled, officer training was intensified, 60 cadets were assigned to specialist artillery training each year, and the tactical doctrine shifted from counter-battery fire to targeting enemy infantry directly. By 1812, the Russian artillery was considered superior to its Austrian and Prussian equivalents. Supply and equipment improvements were also pursued, but Russia's industrial base remained a persistent constraint. Spare kit was only available to a quarter of the army, and a Russian infantryman received just 6 training rounds per year, compared with 50 for a British soldier. The army was better prepared than before, but not yet well prepared. Arakcheyev also took steps to improve discipline and recruitment. The minister arrived at work at 4 a.m. and expected all military officials to do the same. Strict discipline was imposed throughout the military administration and hierarchy, with senior officers expected to record all shortcomings of their juniors. Those who performed poorly were at risk of fines and sacking. Arakcheyev's reforms greatly improved the state of Russia's military administration, drawing praise even from the French ambassador in St. Petersburg. The recruitment system was also reformed. Rather than sending raw recruits directly to their regiments, where mortality had been high, as peasant conscripts struggled to adapt to military life, Arakcheyev's reserve recruit depots provided 9 months of pre-service training, significantly reducing those losses. Despite the administrative success Arakcheyev had achieved, he lacked knowledge of military strategy. He created a decent foundation for the Russian army to be better prepared, but as the war with France grew more imminent by the day, Alexander I needed an experienced military commander to decide on the strategy and tactics of war against Napoleon. The Emperor chose a German-speaking Field Marshal of Scottish descent, Barclay de Tolly, to fulfill this duty, as he became the War Minister in 1810. One of the main outputs of his tenure was the Field Command Regulations in 1812, a 121-page long document which determined the chain of command in wartime and peacetime, clarifying roles of commanders at different levels. This did not solve all organizational and communication problems in the Russian army, but it improved overall command and control on the eve of the French invasion. Improving logistics and supply, an age-old and still persisting problem in vast, poorly connected Russia, was another major focus of the new minister. Supply depots were expanded throughout Western Russia. Provinces declared at war by the emperor were under legal obligation to provide supplies to the army, based on Barclay de Tolly's directive. In terms of capacity, while not in an ideal position, the Russian army was much better prepared for the war with Napoleon in 1812 than in previous rounds. However, the French army was still considered the best in Europe, and beating it would require more, a proper strategy to maximize Russia's advantages and minimize the French strengths. In 1810, Barclay de Tolly suggested this approach to Alexander I. Due to the vastness of the western frontiers of the Russian Empire and the absence of natural obstacles, it would be impossible to defend it. So, instead of giving to Napoleon what he wanted and what he was best at, a decisive battle, in which the French emperor would have most likely prevailed, the Russian war minister proposed a plan for a fighting withdrawal across the front, taking all the food and resources they could from the abandoned territories and burning the rest. The French army would be harassed during its march, being lured into a strong defensive line along the rivers Dvina and Dnieper, where the Russian army would make a stand. Fortress construction along the expected axis of advance was begun but largely incomplete by 1812. Nevertheless, the updated version of this strategy, refined by a Prussian general in Russian service, Karl Ludwig von Pfuhl, was accepted by the emperor. Barclay's First Army in Lithuania would execute the fighting withdrawal to the Drisa camp on the Dvina. Bagration's Second Army in Belarus would harass the French flanks before joining it, and Tormasov's Third Army held the south in Ukraine. The plan was far from perfect, and much of it went unimplemented. A significant faction in the Russian military had argued for an offensive, taking the war to Napoleon in Prussia, a strategy that might have spared Russian territory from devastation and perhaps drawn Prussia to their side. But the defensive logic was sound. Napoleon's record in open, decisive battles was nearly impeccable. Russia's best chance lay not in meeting him on his own terms, but in drawing him deep into scorched earth, overextending his supply lines across a vast and hostile country. Another key consideration behind choosing the defensive strategy was the morale of the Russian people. Stopping Napoleon would require far more than just military preparations. It was going to take a lot of sacrifice from the Russian people, and Alexander I hoped that luring Napoleon into invading Russia would trigger a rally-around-the-flag effect, and indeed it did. The French invasion raised national pride among ordinary Russians, resulting in guerrilla attacks on the French army, participation in the Scorched Earth campaign, and easier mobilization into the army as the war progressed. The parallels with the Second World War, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, are striking. A seemingly invincible enemy making early gains, before being undone by Russian winter and the willingness of its people to endure almost limitless sacrifice. Napoleon's Russian campaign was the beginning of the end for him. The preparations examined here were incomplete, and many plans were only partially executed, but they mattered. None more so than the adoption of an unpopular but ultimately correct strategy, refusing Napoleon the decisive battle he needed, and letting Russia's vast geography do the rest. More videos on the Napoleonic War are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.